It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Craig Hoffman. That is Logan Paulsen. We'll do more on the quarterback position overall tomorrow, but let's get into offensive line.
Sure.
Really interesting group. We came in kind of thinking there were 3 tier 1 players, and I don't know what, and I'm using tier 1 as a generic term here, not as like hey, I put grades on them and there's a line at 92 and that's when we drop off from tier 1 to tier 2. But there's a group of 3 that were all kind of equal at the top, and then there's another group down that's got somewhere between 3 and 8 names in it, let's say. Where are we after this combine, and how confident are you that one of those top 3 are going to be available for Washington at 16?
Yeah, so I think let's just talk about the top 3. So Paris Johnson came in, and he didn't run a 40, but he did all the field work, and he measured. And so he measured at basically 6'7", so 6'6" and 3/8, 218 pounds. He had 36-inch arms, which is
318, not 218.
318, excuse me, yeah. And he had 36.25-inch arms, which is insanely long. Like DeJuan Jones has the longest arms ever measured at the combine. I think they were 36.5, so he's like shorter, longer arms. He's twitchy, like a twitchy athlete on the field moving around. He strains a little harder than I'd like, but he's young. He's like 21, just turned 21. So to me, it's like he's the guy. Like, you don't, like, tackles like that don't come along every year from a physical standpoint. Is his film raw? Yeah, he played guard last year. This is his first year playing left tackle, but if you're taking a swing at a guy in the top 10, like, that's the guy. So I don't think he's going to be around, honestly. He'll be gone. Like Atlanta, if they don't take Robinson, Tennessee, you know what I mean? Like, one of those teams will take a swing on him. Skoronski is the guy from Northwestern who, I don't know, I was a little disappointed with his performance. Like, everyone was telling me he was this tremendous athlete. He jumped well, 34 inches. I think he had like a 9 or 10-1 broad, which is good for an O-lineman, and had like a 5'1" 40. Field drills, he was a little stiffer than I thought he'd be. So a little disappointed. I think he's probably, like, in my mind, a guard now. So I think he probably slides a little bit. And I think he's probably there for Washington at 16. There's an opportunity potentially. I know Mike Renner mentioned him last week when we talked to him, and I think that's probably more likely now than it was before. Now, his tape is impeccable. It's one of the most flawless sets I've ever seen. His hand placement's excellent. His anchor's excellent. So,
and he was playing left tackle, right?
Playing left tackle.
But could he potentially slide over to right tackle, at least for a year, and then pop over to left, if you move on from Leno after next year?
He strikes me as a guy who can kind of do a little bit of everything. Like, they brought him in to play center. He played guard. He played tackle. I will say they do pass sets right and left. His stuff on the right didn't look as crisp as his stuff on the left, but think about it. He's taken, 5,000 pass sets on the left. So I like his film a lot. So I'm willing to kind of like push some of the athletic. They're not even that they're concerns. I just thought he was going to be like a hyper athlete. I thought he was going to be like a sub-5 guy. Thought, the vertical matches up. Thought the broad was going to be, and I thought the field work was going to be awesome, but he was a little stiffer than I would have liked. So take that for what it's worth. But I think 16 was good value for him. Broderick Jones is the other guy from Georgia, and I've not been super high on him. I think the NFL is kind of it with me on this. I think he's probably the best athlete of the group. I think he ran the fastest 40 or one of the fastest 40, like 4.98, something like that. He measured in taller. He was 6'5.5", and he was listed at 6'3" in college. And he came in at like just over 300 pounds. He ran well, stiffened the drill work. And I think as a result, I would kind of bump him down. The other thing about his film that really bothers me, and this is something important for fans listening, is pass protection is the thing you're drafting that guy for. As much as people want to say he's not a great run blocker, so Broderick Jones is excellent in the run game. His pass protection stuff is a little bit up and down, partially because he's a little bit high-waisted when he pass sets, and he has a hard time kind of anchoring. Like, you can visualize that, right, Craig? Someone who kind of is a little bit mushy in the middle and not great with his angles. Again, only played 19 games in his whole career. So you kind of say, well, there's a high upside play there. I think I would push him down, but if you're betting on potential and betting on upside, you probably flip Skoronski and him at 16, just to give you an idea of what's going on there. And then you mentioned that next tier of guys, that's like Darnell Wright from Tennessee, who quite frankly looked excellent, looked very twitchy. He was big. he just looks smooth in all the movement drills. They do like a wave drill where they point and direct the offensive lineman, and he just was gliding everywhere, backpedaling like a DB, and you're just like, awesome. But the guy in that second group who probably helped himself the most is Anton Harrison from Oklahoma. And he's like a basketball hyper athlete, and talk about an excellent pass protector and a terrible run blocker. Like, that's exactly what he is. He's a puppy, needs to grow into his body a little bit. But he's got the pass pro down, and he's a guy that can play left athletically. So naturally he's going to bump up a little bit. And he's the type of guy that when you mention him to a bunch of scouts, their eyes all kind of light up. And there's like a little bit, because the upside's there. There's like an elite athleticism there, an elite understanding of pass pro that gets scouts and gets coaches excited. So I think a lot of people in mock drafts, you're not going to see a name like that at 16. I think that's still a little high for him. I think that's high for Darnell Wright as well. But if you're going to trade back out of that group, like kind of in that 18 to 25 area, I would not be surprised to see either one of those guys go. So if that makes sense.
No, that's good insight. And it's interesting. Like, fans are starting to do, like the draft Nick fans are starting to do a lot of their own, like, check out my mock draft. And I'm like, how are you drafting guys 7 rounds deep? Y'all got,
it's crazy.
Y'all got work to do. But if you watch a lot of college football and like you read a lot of stuff, like you can know. I mean, it's interesting too, because like at this point, I'm like, I don't watch a ton of college football, but I know a lot of these names. Guys that are getting looked at in the 4th, 5th, 6th round for Washington. But I've seen a lot of people mocking trades for Washington at 16.
Yeah.
And Mayhew talked about it a little bit last week. He's like, for value purposes, what you find is when you trade up, like you better be right, because you're obviously moving up for a guy that, that you're higher on than everybody else. And so if you're right, like, sure, it can work out, but like from a value sense, trading back tends to be a lot more successful of a plan. And I think for Washington, especially getting or not having that their natural 3rd round selection because of the Wentz trade, they would love to recoup that. They have a 3rd round selection, but it's basically a 4th. Like, it's an early 4th because it's a compensatory pick at the end of the round that comes from the Brandon Sheriff contract signing in Jacksonville. So I think that for them, a trade, especially if those 3 guys are gone, a trade back into the 18 to 25, take your guy out of the next group, like, makes a lot of sense, because the way this draft could fall, there's going to be some potential guys available that don't, like, there's going to be some edge guys, for instance, that might fall into that range. Let's say like Myles Murphy starts falling into that range. There's going to be another team that wants Myles Murphy, and the Commanders should not draft Myles Murphy. You already are overloaded at that position. Now, would that make it easier to trade Sweat or Young? Sure. And if you want to make that argument, like, I guess I'll hear it. But like, let's say Myles Murphy or Tyree Wilson, who I've seen mocked as high as 3, but like, let's say one of those guys that's not Will Anderson starts to fall because all the O-linemen and all the corners start to go, and there's a run on those positions. Well, now all the guys the Commanders wanted are off the board, and you're sitting there going, we're a little rich for the guys that we really want, but someone else wants whatever. So I think that's really possible.
Well, another thing I wanted to bring up here, then you kind of alluded to this, is like, how do you tier your draft? And what I mean by that is, like, what are your buckets of players, right? So like, let's say for example, like for me, just after the combine, and again, I got to go back and watch some film and kind of continue my evaluation, talking to people, whatever. So right now it's like Paris Johnson, maybe Skoronski are in the same bucket, right? So if you have an opportunity to like get one of those guys, great. But then you get to your second bucket, which is some guys we just talked about. It's, the Broderick Joneses, the Antonio Harrison, Darnell Wright, DeJuan Jones from Ohio State, the big guy that everyone's been talking about. They're kind of all in the same bucket. So if it's 16, you can pick 4 of those guys. Technically, you could probably trade like 6 or 7 spots back and be relatively confident you're going to get one of the guys from that bucket, even if there's a run on tackles, right? Which is kind of what they did last year with Jahan Dotson. Like, there was a lot of good information saying they liked Chris Olave, but if you have Chris Olave and Jahan Dotson in the same bucket, right? And that, there's probably 3 or 4 other receivers you like there, you trade back and you can still get someone from the same bucket, then it works out fine. So that's kind of what you're talking about, right? Like, trade back, get into the right bucket, get into the right guys you want to talk about, And that applies to positions across the board. So we're talking about offensive line here, but the NFL team will bucket, like in that first bucket, let's say Paris Johnson and, Christian Gonzalez is a corner. They're in the same bucket. So like if I'm trading back, I want to make sure I can get one of those two first bucket players, right? And then second bucket, third bucket, all the way down. And as you go, obviously the buckets get bigger and bigger because more people fall into the fourth bucket as opposed to the first bucket, right? Because those are the big time kind of game changing players. So I think that's kind of what to think about, is that in that second bucket, there's probably, there's 4 tackles we just mentioned. There's I would put Matthew Bergeron in that same bucket. So there's 5 guys in that second bucket that you feel, for tackles specifically, that you feel pretty good about, right? And I think I would put Jalen, the kid from Maryland, I forget his last name, Jalen Duncan in a third bucket, but like that's a 5-guy bucket right there for just tackle that you're saying, as long as we can hit one of those guys at 48, or if we trade back, then you feel good about it.
Right. Are there any guards that go in that same bucket, or is guard 2 not quite as valuable as tackle and thus doesn't qualify for those top 2 buckets?
Yeah, so I think there would be a couple guards potentially in there depending on who you talk to. So obviously there's the big fella from Florida, Osiris Torrance, who, when you watch his film, he's not hitting a lot of home runs. And what I mean by that, it's like not a lot of knockdowns. The pass pro is a little bit messy, but he just wins reps. Like he just is in the good position. He went against the guy from Georgia, Jalen Carter, and kind of just locked him down. And so you say it wasn't always pretty. It was kind of messy. He's fallen down sometimes, but he's consistently winning pass protection reps and in the run game. And so I don't know if I'd put him in that tier 2. And again, this is where you get weird with positional value. Like tackles are inherently more valuable than guards, right? So I think Torrance is going to slide down. I think he's still a good football player, right? In that same kind of guard bucket. So whether that's 2 for you or 3 because it's guard and positional value. We talked about that with Mike Renner a little bit the other day. There's Steve Avili from TCU, who's excellent. He moves very nicely, had an excellent field session. Cody Mock has been very, very impressive. And a guy that I'll just throw in there, because I watched his film a little bit and he was excellent on the field, is LSU guard Anthony Buford. Now, no one's talking about him in the third bucket or that second bucket for guards but me. I think there's some off the field stuff going on there, and that's probably why you're in that situation. But again, there's 4 guys right there that you're like, oh, okay. And then there's centers in there too. There's Schultz, there's Tippmann, there's Whippler from Ohio State. They're all probably in that same bucket. So think about it. That's like 10 guys. You feel good probably. And I think if you're Washington, you say there's 5 tackles in bucket 2. There's 4 guards, maybe 5 guards and 3 centers. There's 15. There's, what is that? 4. There's 10 guys. There's a pretty good likelihood one of those guys will be there at 48. And so you feel pretty good about that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Which obviously affects your decision-making at 16. It affects whether or not you trade back in the first round. The one thing I'll say to wrap up this section real quick, though, is like going back to Skoronski, if a field drill where it's like 2 reps of a drill is going to make him drop when every other indicator says he's the guy that is on tape, sign me up for that every day of the week. Like, because we are dealing with incredibly small sample sizes at the combine. Sure. And that, by the way, goes for the athletic testing as well. Like you stutter on one step of the 40 and you lose a tenth of a second. That's the difference between, 4.9, 5.50 for an offensive lineman. And we're talking about one of the best versus like, he's just an average athlete. Like the margins are very, very small and they can be caused by a lot of different things. Obviously it didn't really affect his final time that much, but Anthony Richardson probably could have broken 4.4 if he had just run in a straight line.
Right.
Like he ran 4.43 running a little
like a
mini S.
Yeah.
And so there's things like that, by the way, teams look at this stuff because they actually watch tape of all the drills and they want to see. You guys did a great job on Command Center with my guy Chris Gores, who was obviously on the pod with us last week, breaking down some of what to look for. But like teams actually watch the tape of how guys get in and out of cuts, whatever. But if you see it on film, like who knows? Like they're sleeping in hotel beds. Maybe the guy Skoronski had a bad bed and slept wrong on his hip, and that's why he was tight. I'd much rather rely on the tape. Like obviously you want everything to match up. And we'll see how he moves at his pro day. But like one thing is inherently, or 2 reps of a drill is a very small sample size. And I understand that it's an important part. I'm not even trying to undersell it. It's an important part of the evaluation, because everyone's on the same field, theoretically, the same playing field, or literally they are on it, but theoretically they're on equal footing. And thus, when a guy falls based off of one small thing and the tape is like, no, he's pretty good, and like that wasn't an issue before, I would say probably more often than not that's going to work out. And if Peter Skoronski is available at 16, I think Commanders fans will be very happy, and I think that their happiness will be validated for years to come.
I think that's absolutely right. And like, so when I say that he wasn't, so I guess what I'm saying with that is the film's good, but he's undersized. So you're hoping that he comes out and looks like electric, just not even electric, just looks smooth. And so when it doesn't, you're kind of like, does he have the athletic traits to be Rashawn Slater? Because essentially their measurements are very similar. And Rashawn Slater was like a 4'8" guy, I think he was like a 37, like he did a lot of really dynamic, explosive things. The field work was like buttery smooth, and you're just kind of hoping for something like that. But to your point, I think another guy to talk about is Blake Freeland from BYU. He's 6'7", he's 315 pounds, I think, and he like crushed the combine. He had a 37-inch vertical. He broke the record for offensive lineman. He ran a 4.9. He did all these things that were physically very good, right? Field work was a little bit choppy, but the explosive stuff was there. But then when you watch the film and you watch him at the Senior Bowl, you kind of realize that he's going to have a hard time in pass protection at the next level because he just doesn't have that kind of that play strength to sink his hips and anchor versus good bull rushers. So in terms of, I'm not saying take Blake Freeland over Skoronski. I'm saying if I'm just not as confident. Like I was super confident in the tape of Skoronski, and now just because the athletic measurements they're close, but they're not quite there. I think he's probably a guard, which again depreciates value, right? And I think he's going to be an excellent guard. And this organization's had a lot of success drafting tackles with guards. Brandon Sheriff being Exhibit A. I think he's that kind of player. So at 16, if he's there, I think you're ecstatic. But prior to the draft, prior to the combine, I didn't think he was going to get down here. Now I think there's a world where that could happen, more reasonably happen, I guess is what I'm saying. And it's not to say he's a bad player. I just want to make that perfectly clear.
Yeah. I think the mock draft stuff is going to be really interesting on him in the next couple of weeks. Like I did a prediction yesterday of like the 10 players I think are going to go top 10. I actually did 11 because I said if Jalen Carter and this thing plays out in a way that's bad, like obviously he drops out, and if he does, then I think Miles Murphy will take his spot in the top 10. Obviously not in the same exact draft position, but that was my bonus guy. But Skoronski was on it. And I think
that's reasonable.
Yeah. I might wind up missing that one. It might be Paris Johnson, but we'll see.
So between the two, just based on the combine and based in the film too.
Yeah.
Paris Johnson's one of those guys that's he's got that skyscraper upside, because of the physical traits. And as much as we don't want to say it, like there are good times to bet on traits. And like, if you look historically, like offensive linemen with longer arms tend to play a little bit better. If they're, 6'6" plus, they tend to be a little bit better. If they run what, I'm saying, like it's just, you're just playing percentages. And so I think there's a chance he slips out. I think it's a better chance now than before, but I still think he's a heck of a football player.
Yeah. But what I was going to say is like, as the Mel Kipers and the Todd McShays and the Dane Bruglers and Daniel Jeremiah's talk to teams, especially in the top 10, and they're like, yeah, we actually really like Skoronski, don't let the combine fool you. Then like, if he's still mocked in the top 10, well, I kind of feel like we'll know that answer of whether he'll be a top 10 pick or not before draft night, or whether or not he's fallen. If he's all over the place in mocks, I think there's obviously a better chance.
Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.